Good morning, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak coming to you from my home. Today we are going to start the Russian Revolution, and we are asking ourselves, what changes did the Russian Revolution bring about within Russia and in world affairs? If you would like to read this yourself, if you have a hard copy of the book, this is chapter 20. We're going to be going through this chapter throughout our week. This lesson is covering the material from pages 281 to halfway through 284. So let us start with some themes. Political systems. Russia's monarchy was ended by revolution in 1917 and was replaced by a communist government. Economic. As a result of the Russian Revolution, socialism replaced capitalism in the former Russian Empire. Social structures. The Russian Revolution radically changed the structure of Russian society. So, an introduction to the topic. Tsar Nicholas II was at the front in February 1917. This is World War I, of course. He was there rallying his troops in World War I when word arrived of a strike in Petrograd. Russia's capital city, St. Petersburg, was renamed Petrograd in 1914. The Tsar's aide in Petrograd assured him that the incident was minor and would end when the bitterly cold weather sent the protesters home. Instead, the strike spread, filling the streets with thousands of angry men and women. The Duma, Russia's legislature, wrote to the Tsar that the situation was serious. Tsar Nicholas turned to the army to restore order. When it could not, he decided to return to the capital to deal with the crisis. However, the Duma knew what had to be done. Duma members met the Tsar's train as it neared the city. They told Nicholas that the only way to restore order was for him to step down as Tsar. He tried to abdicate or formally give up power in favor of his brother Mikhail. When Mikhail refused to take the throne, Russia's monarchy came to an end. So if you're following along, at the end of World War I, we get the end of the German monarchy and now the Russian monarchy, kind of tracking those big changes from World War I. Within days, news of these events reached exiled Russian revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in Switzerland. He quickly contacted German officials for permission to travel through Germany on his return to Russia. Germany and Russia were wartime enemies, but the Germans were eager to grant Lenin's request. He openly opposed the war and would end Russia's involvement in it if he came to power there. The Germans offered him safe train passage and money to support his revolutionary activities. Traveling in secret at night, Lenin arrived in Russia in early April. There, he would take control of a revolution that changed not only Russia, but also the world. The overthrow of Nicholas II in 1917 ended more than 300 years of Tsarist rule in Russia. Russian Tsars were autocrats, that is, they held unlimited power to rule. While most European nations, over time, had gradually limited the power of their monarchs, Russia's Tsars continued to govern without being controlled by a constitution until the early 20th century. Russia also lagged behind the rest of Europe in social and economic development. The Industrial Revolution came late to Russia. By 1900, Russia's economy was still based mainly on agriculture. About 20% of the nation's farmland consisted of large estates owned by wealthy nobles. Some 80% of Russians were rural peasants who farmed small tracts of land and lived in grinding poverty. Peasants who moved to cities to work in Russia's developing industries often scrimped and saved to send money back home. However, industrialization and city growth did provide opportunities for entrepreneurs, managers, and engineers. Along with other educated professionals, these Russians created a new social class, Russia's first middle class. Like the nation's wealthy nobles, these middle-class Russians chafed at their lack of power in government. Combined with the discontent of millions of impoverished peasants and urban workers, this situation made Russia ripe for revolution. The unrest that would end in the Russian Revolution of 1917 began in the mid-1800s. At that time, most Russian peasants were still serfs, peasants tied to the nobles' land in a feudal system that the rest of Europe had abandoned long ago. Tsar Alexander II, who came to the throne in 1855, saw danger in continuing this system. It is better to abolish serfdom from above, he told Moscow's nobles in 1856, than to wait until the serfs begin to liberate themselves from below. The Crimean War finally convinced Tsar Alexander II to liberate the serfs. In this war, Russia was defeated by the forces of Great Britain, France, and the Ottoman Turks. This defeat revealed how advanced the Western European nations were in comparison to Russia. It also proved to the Tsar that Russia must reform itself to stay competitive with the more advanced Western nations. One significant reform was to liberate the serfs. And so in 1861, Tsar Alexander II liberated the serfs and ended the feudal system in Russia. I would just point out here that in 1861, this is a good couple hundred years of ending feudalism after the Western Europeans had done so long ago. As a quick, just to kind of compare it, in 1861, the university that I went to was founded, and Russia still had the vestiges of feudalism. Many peasants were disappointed by emancipation. They expected that freedom would include being granted the land that they and their ancestors had farmed for centuries. Instead, those who received land had to pay for it. Emancipation also caused discontent among the nobles. Although they were paid for land that went to the peasants, they lost its use for future income. Some nobles went bankrupt as a result. Others sold all their land and moved to cities where they built factories and started other businesses. So maybe if the Tsar had liberated the serfs and just given them the land so that they could make a living, maybe the peasants would have been into it. But instead, he makes the land, you have to buy it instead of just giving it to them. So even if you may not agree with the feudal system, your family's been there for hundreds of years, and then suddenly it is sold to someone else, making lots of people angry. And then, of course, the people in power, the nobility, many of them also get hurt by the emancipation of the serfs. So you make the bottom of your social structure angry and the people at the top. Not a great set of circumstances for the Tsar. The nobles were also upset by their lack of political power. They pressured Alexander II for a national assembly to represent the wealthy and educated members of Russian society. The Tsar rejected this reform. Instead, he created a system of regional assemblies empowered to deal only with local issues such as road construction and education. All classes, including the peasants, had a voice in these assemblies and in electing their members, though in practice they were controlled by the nobility. So again, the Tsar has an opportunity here to expand representative government, which has happened in other European powers. However, to try to retain a sort of totalitarian power with the Tsar, he does not create those national assemblies or create a national representative system. This is going to, of course, continue to disillusion people in Russia. Alexander II launched other reforms as well. He made changes in the education system that gave more people an opportunity to attend school. Alexander also relaxed laws that made speaking against the government a crime. These two reforms encouraged public discussion of political and social issues. Much of this discussion was highly critical of the government. It inspired revolutionary groups to form that sought to overthrow the government. These organizations drew their membership from the intelligentsia, the term Russians use to describe well-educated citizens who had a strong interest in politics and society. Most members of the intelligentsia were not revolutionaries, but it was from this group that the revolutionaries came. The most radical of them called for socialism and an end to Tsarist rule. Now, before we started this, we did a thing about communism. That was one of your last assignments, but I do have the term from your textbook that they have for socialism. And so remember, socialism is an economic system in which a nation's land, natural resources, industries, and other means of productions are owned collectively or are controlled by the state. So, of course, the big thing here is the end of private ownership. At first, the revolutionaries viewed the peasantry as the best source for creating change. Most peasants lived in villages organized into communes in which all members owned the land jointly. From time to time, this land was redistributed according to each family's need. In 1873 and 1874, radical university students went to the countryside to rouse the peasants to revolt. However, most peasants did not understand the students' message or were not interested in it. Others resented educated young people from the cities telling them what to do. Police arrested hundreds of these students. They were imprisoned or sent to live in remote parts of the empire. Now you can imagine here a 50, 60, 70-year-old Russian peasant and some young 20-year-old whippersnapper telling him how best to live his life. Older generations are generally not a fan of younger people telling them what to do. It was true then. It's true today. The students' failure caused great changes in the revolutionary movement. First, it split the movement into three groups. One group continued to rely on peasants as the source of revolutionary action. A second group began to focus on urban factory workers instead. The third group completely gave up on the people and turned to terrorism to spark change. Finally, the government crackdown, which started with the students, eventually drove all the groups underground. And so instead of having the movements open to the public, where perhaps the government could keep an eye on them and be a part of them, when you force people underground, you force them to be secret and to perhaps radicalize. The terrorist group achieved its main goal in 1881 with the terrorist group achieved its main goal in 1881 with the assassination of Alexander II. But instead of weakening the government, the Tsar's death had the opposite effect. His successor, Alexander III, greatly reduced educational opportunities, weakened the regional assemblies, and tried to bring the peasants' communes under closer control. He also stepped up censorship and the surveillance of revolutionary groups. These and other repressive measures kept the revolutionaries in check for the next 20 years. And so there is glimpses of progress under Alexander II. However, his assassination kind of dedicates the Tsar to repressing and stopping reforms in Russia. I have a note here for you tied to the picture. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by a left-wing terrorist group known as the People's Will. This group came to believe that terrorist acts were the best way to force political reform and bring about the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy. The Tsar was killed by a bomb thrown by a member of the People's Will as he drove through the streets of St. Petersburg. So if you're kind of tracking our class here, we're kind of seeing one little trend of the increase of assassinations of nobles and royalty by small terrorist organizations looking for change. We saw it with Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the Serbian Black Hand, and we see the assassination here of Tsar Alexander II as we look for change in these traditional royal powers as we enter the 20th century. Discontent increased again after Alexander III died in 1894 and was succeeded by his son Nicholas II. Nicholas inspired neither the fear nor the respect that his father had commanded. He had few political ideas beyond protecting his power as Tsar. He angered moderate reformers by calling their goals senseless dreams. Meanwhile, rapid changes in Russia were creating conditions for the growth of more radical movements and reforms. So, Nicholas II, his father, Alexander III, ruled with an iron fist, but his son, Nicholas II, did not have the authority, power, or political acumen to continue to maintain the power of the Tsars, and partially because of his weakness as a leader, Russia will of course, continue to radicalize, and we will get to the actual revolution. But we will get there later, and that is the end of this particular piece of the lesson. I hope you are doing well. Stay healthy, Stay safe.